Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Conatus Views. I'm here with my co-editor, Sarah Mills, for the first time. That's very exciting. Even more exciting than that, we have Julie Bindel, the legendary Julie Bindel.
Hi there.
So this is for a little segment that we're doing Censorship Week. So Julie, you've been in this fight for a long time, haven't you? You've been a veteran campaigner for women's rights. Would you like to tell our audience just a little bit about that?
Well, I've been campaigning to end male sexual violence towards women and girls since I was 17 years old, when I was lucky enough to meet a load of what I call proper feminists, what others might call radical feminists, in Leeds when the movement was very vibrant. And at the time, there was a serial killer of women called Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, who was raping and killing women, and the press decided who was the deserving victim and who was the undeserving victim. In other words, women in street prostitution asked for it, women who were out late at night drinking asked for it, respectable women who just happened to be going to the shop for a pint of milk were innocent victims. So we, in the group I was in, we noticed that there was virulent misogyny that was coming out in a way that you couldn't really ignore through the media and through the way that the police handled the case. And that was my baptism of fire. That was how I ended up prioritizing terrible things that men do to women and to try to stop it. I didn't have what you would call a formal education or any formal kind of employment. And I was semi-feral until my mid-20s, when I met my partner, who said, get yourself to university and get a job. And then I was in research in a university for a while and did lots of different types of work to do with domestic violence and homicide and the like. And then I started writing opinion pieces for The Guardian in the 1990s. And then in the early 2000s, I thought I could do this for real. And therefore, did my first big piece in 2003 for Guardian Weekend, and decided that that I would be a journalist, not necessarily because I love the news or newspapers or radio, although I kind of have come to love them in a way, but because I wanted to get the message out. And most journalists pretended to be impartial, didn't do their research properly, were so liberal that they would bend over backwards to take any position than the one that I subscribe to, which is that men's violence is men's fault and that they should stop actually doing it. So yeah, I suppose I've got a following, and that isn't necessarily pleasing for everybody.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you'd be doing something wrong if you weren't hated by somebody, right? That's just the way things go. But so you entered this sort of debate around transgenderism, an article you wrote, I think, in 2004.
I didn't actually enter a debate, to be honest, and trust me, this isn't me bragging. I started it. I wrote a piece in 2003 questioning the diagnosis of transsexuality, which is its more accurate term, and concluding that this whole born in the wrong body, woman trapped in a man's body, pink brains and blue brains, relied on something incredibly regressive and old-fashioned, which is that there is such a thing as a real man and a real woman, and that gender is innate. You're born liking pink or liking blue. And as a feminist, obviously, as I said before, a proper one, not a liberal one or a fun one, my job is to get rid of gender, to eradicate it, and to declare it as an imposition, as a punishment of women and girls. It's bad for women and girls that we're told that there is something inherent about being feminine or passive, looking up to men, being less rational, being less intelligent, being less strong. And of course, gender is totally socially constructed. So you're born a baby, you don't have any of these traits. They're forced upon women and girls, and they're adopted by boys and men because it privileges them. And so when I wrote my first piece for the Sunday Telegraph magazine, I said, what on earth is this mad diagnosis? If people feel unhappy in their skin, which the vast majority of women and girls on the planet do, if men, because it largely is men, feel that they hate their bodies and want to get rid of masculine traits. Do that. Live as you wish. Call yourself Jennifer. Wear court shoes and skirts. Whatever you want. But don't pretend that this is anything other than rejecting what's been imposed upon you. Don't pretend that this is because you are inherently a woman, because there's no such thing. So a year later, I wrote a piece for The Guardian that was a bit cheeky, a bit rude, but it was based on a story that I'd heard from feminists in Vancouver that were almost shut down. It was a rape crisis centre that does great work, still alive and kicking, and were almost shut down by a male to transgender female person who clearly had set their sights on the centre to test case it, to see if they would accept a male-bodied trans person to counsel rape victims. And when they said no, this wasn't appropriate, there were the human rights lawyers standing at the side, waiting to take Vancouver rape relief to court, and they did for 10 years. And Vancouver, in the end, won. But that was the beginning of the terrible kind of turmoil that women-only services that we set up were to face. And so I wrote a piece in The Guardian about that, and all hell kicked off. And so I, you know, if this hadn't been 15 years of hell, I would pride myself on starting off the debate about whether or not there's any such thing as a woman trapped in a male body.
Isn't there a fair bit of science backing up the idea that people who do experience gender dysphoria, when they're subjected to brain scans, for example, there is a demonstrable difference between how a female brain would behave and how a male brain would behave, influenced by hormones? I don't know if the science is still disputed on that, or...
There is no science. There is a study in Holland, of course, where they've also been looking for a gay gene,
right,
for rather a long time, that they've never found. And it amounts to absolutely nothing. What I would say is read Cordelia Fine, who's a brilliant scientist, and she completely refutes the notion that there is a pink brain and a blue brain. So no, there's nothing at all inherent. There's no scientific basis to this whatsoever. I do believe that gender dysphoria exists. That's why so many young women self-harm. That's why so many young women now are taking the option of defining as male rather than lesbian, or in order to escape sexual harassment and violence and their own hatred of their body. I do believe it exists, but it doesn't exist because there's something innate about gender. It exists because of the imposition of gender roles upon us. And of course, for many young men who don't step up to the mark, whether they're gay, whether they're just a bit sissy, you know, whether they don't want to fight, they don't want to identify with machismo, you know, they get punished by stronger, bigger, more macho males. And so often, you know, they experience a hatred of their own imposed gender. And that the problem is that the terms sex, meaning biological sex, and gender, meaning a social construction, they are used interchangeably and extremely inappropriately. I just had to fill in a form for my visa to go to Canada later today, and I was asked what gender I was. Well, if I'd have had an option, I would have said none. My sex is female. I do not have a gender.
And this is something that absolutely sort of boggles my mind, that there is this sort of total lack of recognizing this distinction, because you'd think that the sort of the trans cause, if you like, would really prioritize talking about the difference between sex and gender. You'd think that would be one of the first things that they hammered out. And yet I see it over and over again, you know, the staunchest trans activists constantly conflating the two terms. Well,
they don't use the term sex anymore. In fact, there's now this Orwellian nonsense coming out of some of their gobs, which is that sex is on a spectrum and it is totally socially constructed, and gender is innate. Well, the opposite is true. And they keep using intersex people as their human shield, because of course the issue for intersex people who might be born with ambiguous genitalia is that surgery is imposed upon them, and they don't actually, you know, fight for the right to have surgery to create neovaginas and neophallus. So let me just make one thing clear. The trans Taliban, as I refer to the misogynist wing of the transgender movement, or the trans cabal, whichever, is not at all representative of the vast majority of transgender people. Transsexual is much more appropriate, because actually, as a lesbian and as a feminist who rejects femininity, I am transgender. You could actually, I fit that description perfectly fine. It means nothing. What we're actually talking about are men who define as women, so male-bodied people who define as adult human females, and vice versa. So the vast majority of people who wish to live as the opposite sex to which they were born do not want any of this Orwellian bullshit imposed upon them in their name. None at all. I have made more transsexual friends since this whole debacle began back in 2003 than exists within the cabal that we see, that we hear, that have prominent positions in the media, that are courted by the media, by the liberal media, who think this is the new frontier, who think this is the new lesbian and gay liberation movement. And these people, those that shout the loudest and that claim that gender is sex and sex is gender and blah, they are misogynists. They are the men's rights movement. That's what they are. They hate women and they want to tell us to shut the fuck up. And the misogyny that I've faced and that other feminists and some men that are on our side have faced has been unbelievable. But the transsexual people that contact me on a really regular basis, some of whom are now my friends, tell me that they daren't speak out because they too will be vilified. One or two trans women now are speaking out. And look what's happened to them. One, Miranda Yardley, has just had a lifetime ban on Twitter imposed because she said that a penis is a male sex organ, or that men are men rather than self-identified women. So this is a men's rights movement. And when I talk about that, and when I talk about the cabal, I do not mean transsexual, transgender people. I mean this hideous group of woman haters, joined by loads of woke blokes with beards, like Owen Jones and others, who just love the fact that they can now scream, fucking shut up, you transphobic cunt, at feminists like me and still be seen as on the right side of history. They're still seen as progressive if they scream at us, transphobe, shut up. You are a bigot, you are a fascist. They've been waiting to do this for decades, and now this is their opportunity.
Yeah, is there a parallel here between something that I'm not super familiar with, the sort of the wars over pornography in the 70s?
Well, any feminist who speaks out from a human rights perspective against sexual violence and degradation, whether it's the sex trade or sexual violence by individual men, we're always called prudes and pearl clutchers and moralists. We're accused of marching with the Christian right, none of which is true. We're told we're anti-sex. We're told that a proper human rights approach, and this is really, really popular amongst men in particular, is to love so-called sex work, is to love pornography. Now, there's a classic example of this when Amnesty International were trying to push forward, which they succeeded in, unfortunately, a policy for the blanket decriminalisation of all aspects of prostitution. Now, of course, any right-minded person wants to stop criminalising the women and men who are being prostituted. But this was Amnesty campaigning to decriminalise pimping, brothel owning and the like. And one head of a large human rights organisation, Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, who's on a massive salary, he's a classic privileged white man, he said of the position that I take and of other feminist abolitionists take, that this was outrageous, that we were effectively taking away the right for poor brown women. I'm paraphrasing, these aren't his words, but it's absolutely what he meant. Taking away the rights for poor, disenfranchised brown women in particular to earn money through quote unquote sex work. And a good friend and colleague of mine, Rachel Moran, who is a sex trade survivor, wrote a brilliant book, My Journey Through Prostitution. She tweeted back, "Do you not think, Kenneth Roth, that if a woman is hungry, the thing to do is put food in her mouth and not your cock?" But I think that that kind of tells the story of the two sides of the debate. This is not an issue of morality or anti-sex prudism for feminists. This is an issue of human rights and the right for the most disenfranchised women not to have a cock shoved in her mouth because she is hungry and that's her only option. And not for white men in the global north to tell women in the global south that that's what's good enough for them.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really important point, is that, as you mentioned, the
Amnesty International, all of them pretty much.
You know, and I did some digging into groups like the Southern Poverty Law Centre as well when they went after Majid Nawaz. And it seems like across the board, all of our sort of movements for social justice, whatever you want to call them, have been co-opted and turned into a tool for profit, for fame, for these sort of rich white men. And now they're using queer theory and so on as a weapon to attack their rivals on the left, or you know, in feminism and so on. Because I want to get back to the response that you faced after writing this article in The Guardian. So what exactly happened?
Since 2004, everywhere I go in the world to speak on violence against women, because I don't go around speaking about the issue of transgenderism. I mean, I do more now because the movement has really taken off and I'm no longer on my own. And this is such a crucial time with the Gender Recognition Act being reformed in a way that would make things worse. But when I would go around the world, whether it was to Denmark, to North America, even to Africa, wherever, speaking against violence against women, meeting with women out there who were doing this work, doing my reporting, my activism, people would turn up, pro-sex trade activists and the transgender activists, because somewhere along the line they became the same group. Because if you're against the sex industry, you are somehow transphobic, because trans women often are in the sex industry. And if you're against the sex trade, then you are racist, because many trans women of color are in the sex trade and therefore you're racist. You're homophobic because many gay men are in the sex trade. So you are just a straightforward bigot if you speak out against either transgender ideology, remember, not trans people, but transgender ideology, and the sex trade. You are worse than Hitler. Note, it's never a mid-range dictator. It's always Hitler, right? They go for the big one. So I would get no platformed. I would get screamed at through a conference hall. I would be stopped from speaking if the venues chickened out because they were threatened. Some of the worst things that have happened to me is when I was invited to speak at the brilliant working class library in Salford about growing up as a working class lesbian in the northeast of England. The trans activists and pro-sex trade organisers of a big picket against me threatened relentlessly the volunteers at this brilliant resource for working class people about our proud history, targeted its sponsors, targeted its donors, threatened all kinds of violence upon the building, tried to get the actual venue closed down because they invited me to speak on being a working class lesbian growing up in the northeast of England. How Orwellian and fucked up is that? And there was a massive petition from the trans activists and the pro-sex trade lobbyists to get me disinvited. I asked several prominent left-wing men, such as Owen Jones, if they would denounce this terrible, terrible treatment of the working class library volunteers. And there was utter silence, total hypocrisy from some of these men who claim to be working class heroes. Incidentally, just as an NB, Owen Jones is middle class, not working class, as people often assume. So that was one of the worst things that happened. I have been in venues ready to speak when I've been told I can't get up there because there's a security risk. I have been disinvited from things and the organisers have put statements out saying It is now a safe space for students to be at this event because Julie Bindel's no longer speaking. I have walked through a university in England ready to debate a pornographer. This pornographer had awarded prizes for porn genres such as exploitedafricans.com, where they were saying, hey, fresh off the boat from Somalia, you can do whatever you want to her, and a parody of the black cab rapist John Warboys raping young women in the back of his cab. This is the kind of pornographer I was debating, and my position was this is violence against women. A load of idiot Bell End students with the orange fringes, the usual lot, were screaming transphobe, bigot, whorephobe at me as we walked through. And the pornographer was just left. Just no one objected to him. And this is because I say that there's no such thing as a woman trapped in a male body, and because I say the sex trade is a gross, racist, capitalist, misogynistic industry that should not exist. How mad is that? I've had grants for violence against women work that I have been awarded, threatened to be taken away from me. I have been disinvited from opening film events with sex trade survivors speaking at it because the trans lobby say they're going to storm the cinema. You know, it goes on and on and on. And all the time that they're actually doing this to me, I am saying, I will debate you. I will come and sit and talk with you. I would never close down an event of yours. You know, I'm not your enemy. And still it persists. And every time that somebody wants to host a debate between me and a trans person who disagrees with my position, which I'm always happy to do, the cabal, even though there's a trans person there talking to me willingly, they try to shut that down too. And then the trans person that's spoken to me is excommunicated.
Yeah, it's really, really chilling stuff. There's a thing where it's become a total reversal. People have been saying that actually the feminists describing sex work are actually worse. The feminists describing violence against women are actually worse than the men committing the violence themselves, and that really must be the ultimate inversion of how things should be.
I think some mad tweet yesterday or the day before that somebody sent to me was that I am bathing in the blood of sex workers. You know, when I work alongside sex trade survivors, who are the ones that tell the truth about what happens in the industry, who are abolitionists, who are experts about the police, about the Johns, about the pimps. 50 of them that I interviewed in my book said pretty much the same thing, and they were from all different types of prostitution experiences. You know, I don't actually speak for women in prostitution. You know, I work alongside women who have exited the sex trade, and yet the Johns aren't violent, the police aren't violent, the pimps aren't violent. We are violent. A sex trade survivor that I work with very closely, Bridget Perrier, who is a First Nations woman from Canada, who is raising 2 orphans whose mothers were murdered by Robert Picton, who killed at least 200 women in prostitution in Canada, and fed their chopped up bodies to his pigs. She went on British television when we were having an event over here a couple of years ago with a member of the English Collective of Prostitutes that are not English, they're not a collective, and they've never been in prostitution. They're kind of mad orthodox trots, love the sex trade. One of them said to her in the green room on their way to be interviewed on Channel 4, "You have blood on your hands." So a woman who's never been in the sex trade says this to a First Nations woman who campaigns against the violence that is constant within her community of Indigenous women and girls. She was told she had blood on her hands. They're propping up this capitalist, racist hell called the sex trade, and I don't know why.
What do you think has given rise to this sort of culture where you see like campaigners going to universities and educating students on safety in sex work, or handing out those welcome bags that we saw advertising toothpaste, and like what's given rise to this sort of culture?
Well, first of all, you know, the University of Brighton Freshers stall, where women and men were invited to go and talk about safety in sex work. Of course, I have no objection to prostituted people being given condoms, clean needles, support, a cup of tea, a shoulder to cry on, all of the kind of stuff that anyone involved in this hellish trade would need. That's not the issue. I want people, obviously, to be offered the support to get out of the sex trade, because that's what the vast, vast majority of anyone in prostitution wants. But this stall was completely normalizing the fact that pimps are procuring young women in the main into the sex trade and seeing it as just something like working at McDonald's. But as one sex trade survivor said to me, you know, at least at McDonald's, you are not the meat. When you're in the sex trade, you are the meat. And all those male students and lecturers walking past that stall, seeing this as completely and utterly without any kind of problem attached to it. I'm not talking about stigmatizing the women in prostitution, of course not. But these pimps and escort agency owners and the sugar daddy sites that are luring young women into this hellish existence, having a stall like it's, hey, here's the stall for working at All Bar One. You know, we can tell you how our recruitment process works and what the hours are like and how you can learn to mix a good cocktail. What are they going to do on this stall? Teach them how to give a good blowjob. So you asked me why we've ended up in this situation. Queer theory, neoliberalism, where the woman's body is a marketplace. Because remember, we don't consider men from a country in Africa who's desperate to escape to come to Europe selling his kidney. We don't view that. The left doesn't view that as unproblematic. The left would consider that an abhorrence and would want the surgeon, the broker, and the person who put the order in for the kidney to be prosecuted or dealt with in some way, at least condemned. But we consider women in Cambodia selling breast milk, or women's wombs being rented as so-called surrogate mothers for rich gay men to use to have their own biological children. We consider the inside of a woman's body to be a marketplace in prostitution, her anus, her mouth, her vagina. That's okay. So it's neoliberalism has somehow ended up being more attractive to the left when we're talking about the female body as a marketplace. Queer theory has a lot to answer for, because of course it still recognizes that race is not a floating signifier, as they now refer to gender and the reality of being a woman under patriarchy. That's now up for grabs. That has no meaning attached at all. Race still does. People still go absolutely crazy when the likes of Rachel Dolezal, who masqueraded as a woman of color all that time in North America, lived her life in that way, masqueraded as a person of color. That's outrageous to the left. And certainly I'm critical of it too. But Bruce Jenner becoming Caitlyn Jenner, being Woman of the Year, that's something different that we should just swallow. So, you know, I think it's that we have grown a new set of identity politics that I lived through in the 80s, but now there's no politics attached to it. It's identity politics without the politics. It's the politics of the individual, of the very highly privileged whingers. And, you know, unfortunately, it's because of the demise of the working class and the demise of a politics rooted in the material reality of people's lives, including women, and in particular working class and poor women.
Thank you so much for joining us, Julie. It's been an absolute honour to have you on our show. So hopefully you've enjoyed our conversation with Julie Bindel. Do share it if you want other people to see it. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. If you have anything to add, do leave a comment underneath, and hopefully we will see you again soon. Thank you.